The old man's hands trembled as he shuffled down the dimly lit street, his every step echoing in the silence of the night. He was used to being alone, had been for years, but tonight felt different. There was a strange, unsettling weight in the air, like something was about to change. He stopped in his tracks. Just ahead, a young girl stood in the doorway of a rundown building, her silhouette barely visible against the flickering streetlight. She couldn't have been more than 10, yet there was something about her that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Something, out of place. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. The world around him seemed to blur, as if the girl wasn't fully part of it. But before he could take another step, his body faltered. His vision blurred, and the world tilted. The ache in his chest, a familiar, constant companion, flared up again, sharper than ever. Then, unexpectedly, the girl stepped forward. "Are you all right, sir?" Her voice was soft, yet it cut through the chaos in his mind like a knife. His heart skipped a beat. How had she known? He hadn't spoken a word to anyone for days. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. His whole life had been built around blending into the shadows, avoiding the notice of others. But here she was, looking directly at him, concern in her wide, brown eyes. He tried to muster some words, to tell her he was fine, that he was just a bit old and tired. But nothing came out. Instead, his knees buckled, and he collapsed. The girl didn't flinch. In one swift motion, she was there, kneeling beside him, her small hand supporting his frail body. "Let me help you," she said, her voice unwavering. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even hesitant. It was as if she had done this before, as if helping strangers in the dark was simply a part of her world. He couldn't understand it. How could she, of all people, be so calm? He had spent his whole life closing himself off from the world. And yet, here was this child, offering her strength to a man who had long since given up on anyone caring. The seconds felt like hours as she gently helped him to his feet, her hand warm against his. He felt a strange shift within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Was it hope? Was it trust? "I'm fine now," he muttered, trying to pull away from her grip, but she held firm. "No, you're not," she replied softly. "But you will be." The words hung in the air, a promise and a mystery. And in that moment, for the first time in ages, he wondered if perhaps there was more to life than what he had seen. If this chance encounter, this brief moment of kindness, might just be the start of something he couldn't yet understand. As she walked away, the girl turned back once, her eyes locking with his one last time. A knowing look flashed between them, one that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of time itself. Then, without a word, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving him standing in the cold, his heart pounding with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. He looked around, half expecting the world to make sense again, but it didn't. The street was still quiet, the night as still as before. He was alone again. But this time, something felt different. And then, the feeling hit him, a realization that slammed into his chest like a freight train. It was her. The girl. She had changed something in him, something deep and hidden. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, with every fiber of his being, that this chance encounter wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something he couldn't yet comprehend. And just as quickly as it had come, the feeling was gone. The night resumed its eerie silence, but the old man knew one thing for certain. His life, the one he had carefully constructed around his own isolation, would never be the same again. But why? What was it about this child that stirred him so deeply? And more importantly, why did he feel like the world had just shifted, as if something, or someone, was watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? He didn't have the answers, but something told him they were coming. And when they did, he might just be ready to face whatever lay ahead. In the days that followed the unexpected encounter, the elderly man went back to his usual routine. His life had always been a cycle of isolation. Every morning, he would sit by his window, staring out at the world, but never really feeling a part of it. His house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wooden floors or the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. The walls seemed to echo his loneliness, and he rarely ventured beyond the front door. The world outside had become a place that seemed too fast, too loud, and far too disconnected from the slow rhythm he had grown used to. He would often go for short walks, more out of habit than necessity, but always at a pace that allowed him to remain unnoticed. He preferred it that way. The world had moved on, leaving him behind, and he had learned to be invisible. But something had shifted since the little girl had helped him that afternoon. It was as if, for the first time in years, someone had truly seen him, not just as an old man walking down the street, but as a person. Her smile, innocent and warm, had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The girl had simply noticed that he struggled with his bags and had offered to help. There had been no hesitation in her gesture, no reluctance or fear. She had just offered her hand and helped him carry the heavy load. It was a small act, but it had brought a spark of connection that he hadn't realized he was missing. That evening, as he sat in his chair by the window, he found himself thinking about her. The memory of her kindness lingered in his mind, a soft light in the otherwise dull corners of his life. As the days passed, he found himself looking for her. Not with any real purpose, but simply because her presence seemed to have changed something inside him. The world outside, once so distant, had become a little brighter, a little more alive. One afternoon, as he shuffled down the same familiar street, he saw her again. She was walking towards him, her small figure skipping along with an energy that contrasted sharply with his slow, deliberate pace. She waved at him, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth that had drawn him to her before. "Hello, sir," she greeted him with a bright smile, her voice carrying the same cheerful tone as the first time they had met. "Hello, little one," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if the simple conversation required more effort than he was used to. But he didn't mind. For some reason, the words felt good. They exchanged pleasantries, and again she offered her help, even though he didn't need it this time. But he didn't refuse. For reasons he couldn't explain, he welcomed her company. Over the next few weeks, their interactions continued, though they were brief. She would stop by his house whenever she could, and they would chat for a few minutes, talking about nothing in particular. She had a way of making the world seem a little more manageable, a little less daunting. But as much as the elderly man appreciated these small moments, something still felt out of place. It was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, one he couldn't shake. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it was there, lingering. One evening, as the sun began to set and the cool air of twilight filled the streets, the elderly man walked to the corner store for a loaf of bread. It had become a part of his routine, though he rarely needed much. But that day, as he reached for the door handle, something strange happened. A figure appeared at the edge of his vision, standing just outside the store, seemingly watching him. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The man stood still, as if waiting for something, but the elderly man couldn't tell what. The figure didn't approach, but the man could feel his presence, an unsettling sensation creeping over him. He hesitated at the door, his hand still on the handle, wondering if he should go inside or turn and walk away. Something about the stranger didn't sit right with him, but the man couldn't put his finger on why. The stranger's gaze felt like it was directed at him, though it was impossible to see his eyes. After a moment that seemed to stretch on for far too long, the elderly man decided to continue inside. He couldn't explain why he felt uneasy, but he didn't want to stay in the presence of the stranger any longer than necessary. As he turned to walk through the door, he glanced back once more, but the stranger was gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. That night, the elderly man couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His usual sense of isolation seemed more pronounced, as though the world had become a little colder. The familiar ticking of the clock on the wall felt louder, more oppressive. He tried to push the feeling aside, but it lingered, gnawing at him. The next morning, as he sipped his tea in the quiet of his living room, he couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter with the mysterious man. The unease that had begun the night before only deepened as the hours passed. And that's when the thought crossed his mind, what if this wasn't just some random encounter? What if this stranger was somehow connected to the little girl? His heart skipped a beat at the thought. Could the mysterious figure have been watching him for a reason? Was this stranger somehow tied to the warmth and light the girl had brought into his life? The questions haunted him as he tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the day. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push the feeling away. Something was changing, something was about to happen, and he had no idea what it was. The days after the encounter felt heavy for the girl. She couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man. The weight of that brief interaction lingered in her mind like a forgotten melody that kept playing in the background. Every time she tried to push it away, it returned, drawing her back into the strange feeling she had experienced when she helped him. Something was off, something that she couldn't quite place. She had tried to forget about him, telling herself that it was just a random moment, one of many in a busy city where people often crossed paths without ever truly knowing one another. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. There was something more, something hidden behind the man's worn-out coat and the tiredness in his eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with him was somehow different. It was early morning when she saw him again. She was walking to the market when she spotted him, standing in front of his small, run-down house. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his eyes focused on something far in the distance. As she walked closer, she saw him speak to someone, a man, tall and dark-haired, with an air of mystery about him. He didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in that neighborhood, yet there he was, standing on the porch, talking to the elderly man. The girl stopped in her tracks, hiding behind a corner, not wanting to intrude. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension between the two was palpable. The stranger's body language was stiff, and the elderly man seemed visibly agitated. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy that only deepened the girl's curiosity. For a moment, she wondered if she should walk away. It was none of her business, after all. But something stopped her, some unspoken instinct that told her she needed to stay. She took a few steps forward, her heart racing as she moved closer. The air around them felt thick with something unspoken, as though the stranger had just appeared from nowhere to confront the elderly man with something important. Something the girl wasn't supposed to know. She watched, hidden from view, as the stranger handed the elderly man a small, worn-out envelope. The man took it reluctantly, almost as if it was a burden he had been avoiding for years. His fingers trembled as they touched the paper, and the stranger's eyes never left him. It was clear the envelope held something of great significance, but what? And why had the stranger chosen this moment to deliver it? The girl felt an odd compulsion to step forward and ask, but she stopped herself. The scene unfolding before her was too strange, too heavy. The air felt charged with tension, and she knew she was on the edge of something bigger than herself, something far beyond the life she knew. After a long silence, the elderly man finally spoke. His voice was low, but the girl could hear the frustration in his words. "You shouldn't have come back." The stranger's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it. "I had no choice," he replied, his voice tinged with regret. "You've waited too long." The elderly man shook his head slowly, as if in denial. "I've done everything I can to keep it buried. You need to leave." The girl's heart pounded in her chest. What were they talking about? What was this secret that the old man had been hiding for so long? The stranger stepped closer, his face only inches away from the elderly man's. I can't leave until you face the truth. The elderly man's eyes widened, and he seemed to deflate, like a balloon losing air. For a moment, it looked as though the man might collapse, but the stranger caught him by the arm and steadied him. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The stranger was not just anyone, he was someone who knew the elderly man's deepest secrets. Someone who had the power to unearth things long buried. The girl stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She had to know more. She had to understand what this was all about. But just as she took a step forward, the door to the house slammed shut. The elderly man had retreated inside, and the stranger was left standing on the porch, staring out into the street, his face a mask of uncertainty. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. The girl's mind raced with questions, but no answers came. She had glimpsed something she wasn't meant to see, something that raised more questions than it answered. As she turned to leave, her heart heavy with confusion, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that this strange encounter was just the beginning. Something big was unfolding, and she was now caught in the middle of it, whether she liked it or not. But what could she do now? Where would this strange story lead her? For now, all she could do was wait. But she knew one thing for sure, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like they stretched endlessly before him, each one as ordinary as the last. Yet, the memory of the little girl lingered in his mind, playing like a broken record, her voice echoing in his thoughts. You will be. The words felt like a promise. But promise of what? He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something that was slowly unraveling in the corners of his life, just out of sight. The old man continued his daily routines, but there was a persistent unease that gnawed at him. He went to the same cafe in the morning, sat at the same table by the window, sipped his coffee, and watched the world pass by. But this time, it felt different. The people around him moved like shadows, distant, untouchable. He had always been someone who kept to himself, but now, in the stillness of the cafe, he felt more alone than ever before. It was then that he noticed it. A faint flutter at the edge of his vision, a shadow moving quickly across the street outside. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that face. The little girl. Without thinking, he stood up and rushed to the door, pushing past startled patrons. Outside, the wind hit him with a rush of cold air, and his breath came in sharp gasps as he scanned the street. There was no sign of her, but the strange feeling in his chest tightened. What was happening? Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? He walked aimlessly down the street, his eyes darting from side to side, looking for some sign, some clue that might explain this feeling. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Looking for someone? He spun around, startled. Standing in front of him was a man, tall, with sharp features and a presence that felt almost otherworldly. His face was familiar, yet he couldn't place it. The man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You've been looking for her, haven't you? The man continued. The old man's heart raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was something about this stranger that unsettled him, something that felt too familiar, too calculated. The stranger seemed to read his thoughts as if they were written on his face. You're wondering why, the man said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. Why she seemed to know you. Why you feel this pull to her. You want answers, don't you? The old man took a step back, instinctively raising his hands, as if to ward off the stranger's probing gaze. Who are you? He managed to say, his voice trembling. Who am I? The man's smile widened. I'm someone who has been watching you for a very long time. And I know the truth about her, and about you. The words hit him like a punch. The truth? About the little girl? About him? The stranger leaned in closer, his eyes never leaving the old man's. The past has a way of catching up with us. Things you thought were long forgotten, they resurface when you least expect it. The old man's breath hitched. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear whatever this man had to say, but some part of him knew that he had no choice. "What do you know about her?" The words came out before he could stop them, desperate for answers. The stranger's gaze flickered to the street, his eyes narrowing. "She's part of something much larger than either of us. Something that goes beyond time. Beyond everything." The old man's head spun. His chest tightened, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. What was this man talking about? Time? Beyond everything? The stranger continued, "She's not just a little girl. And you are not just an old man, wandering the streets of a forgotten city." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Who are you?" the old man repeated, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "I'm the one who will show you the way," the stranger said, his smile now gone. His eyes were cold, but there was something in them that hinted at something more, something ancient, something powerful. Before the old man could react, the stranger turned on his heel and began walking away, as if the conversation had already ended. The old man stood frozen, his mind racing. He wanted to follow. He wanted to demand more answers. But a strange pull, deep within him, stopped him. Something about this stranger, it didn't feel right. But it didn't feel wrong either. It felt like he was meant to be there, like he was part of the plan that was unfolding before him, whether he was ready for it or not. As the stranger disappeared around the corner, the old man's thoughts swirled. His mind was a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and curiosity. What was going on? Who was this man? And how was the little girl connected to all of this? For the first time in years, the old man felt a flicker of hope mixed with dread. He had lived his life in isolation, shying away from the unknown. But now, it seemed like the unknown was coming for him, whether he liked it or not. The girl. The stranger. Time. Secrets. It was all connected, and he knew that the answers were just beyond his reach. And somehow, he was starting to understand that he was no longer in control. The days went by, but the unsettling feeling continued to gnaw at the elderly man. He couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious stranger, whose face he could never quite see. Each time he walked down the street or stepped out of his house, he felt like someone, or something, was watching him. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The little girl, on the other hand, continued to visit him. Her presence had become a small light in his otherwise quiet existence. She would show up at his door with her usual cheerful smile, always eager to help, always full of energy. Sometimes, they would sit together on the old bench in his front yard, talking about simple things, the weather, the flowers blooming in the garden, or what she had learned in school. The elderly man had started looking forward to these moments, though he never let on. Her kindness had started to feel like a balm to his soul, soothing a part of him that had been untouched for far too long. Yet, even in these peaceful moments, something inside him began to stir. It wasn't just the stranger's presence that unsettled him anymore. It was the girl, too. There was something about her that he couldn't quite place, a connection that felt both comforting and deeply mysterious. She seemed too innocent, too pure, and yet, there were times when he saw a shadow in her eyes, as though she carried a weight far beyond her years. It wasn't until one afternoon that everything began to unravel. The elderly man was sitting in his chair, staring out the window as he always did, when he saw her walking up the street again. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone. The mysterious stranger was standing a few paces behind her, his figure unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat. The stranger's tall, dark silhouette loomed over the little girl, and it was as if the world around him held its breath. The elderly man could feel his pulse quicken, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests of his chair. Something about the way the stranger stood there, silent and still, sent a wave of unease through him. The girl smiled brightly as usual, her eyes lighting up when she saw him sitting by the window. She waved, but the elderly man couldn't bring himself to wave back. Instead, he watched, his gaze fixed on the stranger. The little girl walked closer, and the elderly man noticed something strange. The stranger's eyes seemed to be fixed on him, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was as if the man knew him, knew everything about him. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The air around him seemed to grow thick, and for a moment, he almost couldn't breathe. When the girl reached the door, she knocked lightly, her usual cheerful self. But this time, there was a hesitation in her steps, as if she too could feel the strange presence of the stranger behind her. The elderly man's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why had the stranger come again? What was his purpose? He opened the door, his hands still shaking slightly, and there she was, the girl, standing with her usual bright smile, but something was different about her too. Her eyes held a depth to them now, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. And just behind her, the stranger stood, silent and waiting. "Good afternoon, sir," the girl said, her voice carrying the same warmth, but her tone was softer, almost hesitant. She glanced back at the stranger, as if waiting for his approval before speaking. The elderly man didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled in confusion. He glanced at the stranger, who stood motionless, as if waiting for something. The man could feel the weight of his gaze, and a knot tightened in his stomach. There was something deeply wrong about all of this, something he couldn't yet understand. Who is he?" the elderly man finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. He could barely look away from the stranger, who had yet to speak a word. The little girl seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes flickering between the elderly man and the stranger. Then, in a voice that was far too calm for her age, she spoke. "He's the one who showed me the way," she said quietly. "He's the one who brought me to you." The elderly man's heart stopped for a moment, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stood there, frozen, trying to process what she had said. "The way to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You've been waiting, old man," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Waiting for something you don't even understand. And now, the time has come." The words hung in the air, thick with an ominous weight. The elderly man's heart raced as the stranger's gaze seemed to pierce right through him. The little girl, who had once seemed so innocent, stood silently beside the man, her small figure now feeling strangely otherworldly. The mystery deepened, and the elderly man knew that nothing would ever be the same. The stranger had come to reveal something he had been blind to, something that would change everything. But the question remained, what was it? What was the truth behind all of this? The days that followed felt like a blur for the girl. She couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man and the mysterious stranger. The encounter at the house haunted her, replaying over and over in her mind. Every word, every gesture between the two men carried weight, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The more she tried to push it out of her mind, the more she realized that the mysterious stranger was the key to something far bigger than she had imagined. She had tried to convince herself that the situation was just a strange coincidence. After all, people had their secrets, didn't they? Everyone had a past they didn't want to reveal. But this felt different. The girl felt it deep in her gut, something was not right. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the elderly man wasn't just any old man. He had a past. And whatever it was dangerous. The following afternoon, as the sun began to set, she found herself standing outside his house again, this time determined to find out more. She had to know what had been hidden for so long. She wasn't sure what had drawn her back, but she knew that the answers lay within those walls. But as she approached the door, she hesitated. What if the stranger was still there? What if the elderly man didn't want to see her again? What if she wasn't supposed to know the truth? She stood there for a moment, weighing the consequences of her actions. But curiosity won out. She knocked softly on the door. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing the elderly man. His face was tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place, something between guilt and fear. The girl's heart raced. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself stepping inside, drawn in by the same feeling that had led her to him in the first place. Something was pulling her toward the truth, and now, there was no turning back. The elderly man didn't say a word as he closed the door behind her. He just stood there, his back hunched, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, the girl broke the silence. What's going on? Who was that man? The old man's face faltered. He seemed to shrink before her eyes, as though he had aged 10 years in an instant. He sat down in a worn-out chair near the window, staring out at the street as if searching for something. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then, finally, his voice came out in a low murmur. That man, he's someone I've been trying to forget for a very long time. The girl waited, her breath caught in her chest. She could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, but she didn't push him. She had to let him speak when he was ready. The elderly man finally turned to face her. I never wanted you to get involved in this. I never wanted you to know the truth. But now that you've seen him, there's no going back. You've opened a door that can't be closed. The girl's heart raced. What truth? The elderly man took a deep breath and closed his eyes, as though summoning the strength to speak. Many years ago, I was part of something far bigger than you can imagine. Something that no one would believe, even if I told them. The girl leaned forward, unable to contain her curiosity. What was it? What happened? The elderly man's gaze became distant, as though he was reliving something long buried. I was part of a secret organization. We worked in the shadows, doing things that no one would understand. It was supposed to stay that way, hidden, protected, safe from the world. But mistakes were made. People got hurt. And in the end, I walked away. The girl was stunned. She had never suspected anything like this. The elderly man, someone she had always thought of as just a lonely old man, had been part of something dark and dangerous. But why had he left? And why had the stranger come back now? The elderly man's voice grew quieter. The man you saw, he was my partner. We were close, once. But things went wrong. We disagreed on the path we were taking. And when I left, I thought I was done with it. But he's come back because of what happened. Because of the things we did. The girl's head spun as she tried to process the gravity of his words. She had always known that there was something unusual about the old man, something that didn't quite add up. But this? This was far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Before she could say anything, the door creaked open again. The girl turned in surprise to see the stranger standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on her. The man had followed her inside, as if he knew exactly what she was learning. I see you've told her, the stranger said, his voice cold. The girl stood up quickly, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. The tension between the three of them was suffocating. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling. The stranger stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the elderly man. I'm the man who was sent to finish what you started. The girl's stomach dropped. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure, nothing in her life was ever going to be the same again. The days blurred together in a haze of confusion and uncertainty. Every step the old man took seemed to pull him deeper into a web he couldn't escape. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal what he was meant to understand. The stranger's words had haunted him since their encounter. She's part of something much larger than either of us. Something that goes beyond time. Beyond everything. Those words echoed in his mind, twisting into strange shapes, and he found himself asking the same question over and over: who was the little girl? As if the universe had answered his unspoken query, the girl appeared again. It was late afternoon when she showed up on the same street corner he had seen her last, standing just as before, an almost ethereal presence against the backdrop of the fading sunlight. This time, however, there was something different about her. Her eyes, though still full of innocence, held a quiet sadness, a knowing that she hadn't revealed before. And there was something else, an energy surrounding her that made the old man feel as though time itself had shifted. He felt drawn to her, as if his very soul were tethered to hers in a way he couldn't explain. She was no longer just a child, at least not in the way he understood it. She was something more. Something otherworldly. As he walked closer, she turned to face him, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost distant, as though she were speaking from a far-off place. "You've been asking questions," she said, her gaze piercing him. "You want to know the truth." The old man hesitated. There was so much he wanted to say, so many things he had to understand. But the words caught in his throat. He was afraid to ask, afraid of what the truth might mean. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. "Why am I involved in this?" The girl stepped closer, her small hand reaching up to gently touch his arm. A warmth spread through him at her touch, the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years, not since he had lost everything. "Because you're the one who can stop it," she said simply. "It's always been you." The old man's heart pounded in his chest. "Stop what? What do you mean?" The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the horizon, as though she were looking at something far beyond the ordinary world. "The world you know," she said softly, "isn't the world it seems to be. There are forces beyond understanding, forces that control everything. But there's always a way to change things, to set things right." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with an ancient wisdom, far beyond her years. "But the cost of that change is high. And you're the one who must decide whether it's worth it." The old man felt a chill crawl down his spine. The air around them had shifted, and the world felt unnaturally still. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt muffled, as though the sound were coming from a far-off place, not the present moment. Everything around him seemed to exist in a strange haze, like he was stepping through the veil between this world and something else. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape from this conversation, from the weight of the choice that loomed over him like a storm on the horizon. But the girl's words had rooted him to the spot. "Who are you?" he asked again, the question slipping from his lips almost without thought. Her gaze softened, a faint flicker of sadness passing over her features. "I'm someone who's been waiting for you. Someone who's been waiting for you to remember." The world seemed to tilt as those words hit him. Remember? What was she talking about? He hadn't forgotten anything, at least, not anything important. But then, something stirred deep within him, a memory, buried so far beneath the surface that he had nearly convinced himself it had been a dream. He remembered flashes, the sounds of strange whispers in the dark, faces that weren't quite human, glimpses of something far beyond this world. And then, a name. A name that he couldn't place, but it felt like it had been carved into his soul. He stumbled back, the weight of the revelation threatening to crush him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. But the little girl was there, steadying him, her grip firm but comforting. You've seen it, haven't you? She asked, her voice gentle yet insistent. You've felt it. The old man nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. It was as if the fog in his mind was clearing, revealing something he had been blind to for so long. But what did it mean? What was it that had been hidden from him? Before he could speak again, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. The ground beneath his feet vibrated, and the sky above shifted in color, as though something from another time and place was pushing through the barrier of reality. The girl turned toward the horizon, her expression distant. It's starting, she whispered, almost to herself. The old man followed her gaze, his heart racing. In the distance, something was moving, something vast, something that filled him with both awe and terror. It was as if the very fabric of reality was bending, breaking. And he understood then, he wasn't just a bystander in this strange unfolding story. He was part of it. The choice he made now would determine everything. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. It's your turn now. Will you do what needs to be done? Or will you let the world fall apart? The old man's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. But in that moment, something inside him clicked into place. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the choice was never about him. It was about what came after, what would happen to the world if he didn't take action. And with that realization, he made his decision. He wasn't going to let the world fall apart, not this time. The elderly man stood frozen in the doorway, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like an invisible force, making it hard to breathe. He looked at the little girl, whose face now seemed impossibly calm, as though she knew exactly what was about to unfold. Her eyes, once full of innocent wonder, now held a depth that made him feel small, insignificant. The stranger's presence was overpowering. He had always been an observer, someone who stayed on the outskirts of the world, but now it felt as though the world was closing in on him. The stranger didn't seem to need to explain further. His words were enough. He had spoken of waiting, of something that the elderly man didn't understand, something he had been blind to all along. But what was it? The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a tension that made every muscle in his body feel tight. He could hear his own heartbeat, each thump louder than the last. It was almost as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The little girl remained silent, her gaze locked on him, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the elderly man managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it you want from me?" The stranger's eyes flickered, and he took a slow step forward. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice cold and detached. "I've come to show you something. Something you've been blind to for far too long." The elderly man's mind raced. What could he possibly be blind to? He had lived a life of solitude, of quiet moments alone, content in his routines, and had never asked for anything more. Was he supposed to be looking for something? What had he missed? The stranger took another step closer, his dark eyes unwavering. "You've spent your life hiding from the world, hiding from your own past. But now it's time to face it." The girl. He paused, glancing at the little girl. "She brought me here to help you see. To help you understand." The elderly man's head was spinning. His mind couldn't make sense of it all. He had spent so many years in quiet isolation, content with the little world he had created for himself. He had never thought to look beyond it, never believed there was anything more. But now, with the stranger standing in front of him and the girl at his side, he realized that everything he had known was about to be turned upside down. He felt the sudden urge to retreat, to shut the door and lock it all out, but something deep inside him held him in place. A strange, invisible pull seemed to anchor him to the spot. He had to know. He had to understand. "What is it?" he asked again, his voice shaking now. "What do I need to see?" The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was knowing, as though he had been waiting for this moment for far longer than the elderly man could comprehend. "Everything you've experienced, everything you've lived through, it was all part of a greater plan," the stranger said. "Your life has been leading you to this point, and you've never truly seen it until now." The elderly man's breath caught in his throat. A greater plan? Was this some kind of delusion, some strange fantasy his mind was conjuring in the wake of years of loneliness? Or was it something else? The girl stepped forward then, her voice softer now, yet filled with an unsettling confidence. "You helped me," she said. "I was lost. But you showed me kindness when no one else would. And now, it's my turn to help you. To show you what you've been missing." The words hit him like a blow. The realization dawned on him slowly, like a slow-motion unfolding. He had helped her. A small act of kindness, something he had done without thinking, had brought her into his life. She had changed everything. But now, she was telling him that he was the one who needed to change. That his life, his purpose, was something greater than he had ever realized. A wave of emotion washed over him. Regret, sorrow, guilt. He had spent so many years thinking that his life didn't matter, that he was too old, too far removed from the world to make a difference. But now, the girl's words made him question everything he had believed. He had helped her, yes, but what had he truly given? Had he ever really lived? Had he ever truly seen beyond his own quiet existence? The stranger, who had remained silent until now, spoke again, his voice low and grave. "Your life was meant for more than just existing. You've been given a chance to see the truth, to face the consequences of your choices. The girl, she's not just a child. She's part of the reason you're here, part of the reason you've been shown the way." The words echoed in the elderly man's mind, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not hope for the future, not hope for some grand revelation, but hope for the past, for everything he had missed. It was as if the weight of his regret and his isolation were finally beginning to lift, just a little. The stranger's presence, once so ominous, now seemed to carry a strange kind of peace. He wasn't there to harm him. He was there to help him face what he had avoided for so long. And the girl, who had shown him nothing but kindness, was the key. She was the one who had brought him to this point. The truth, as it turned out, wasn't about some grand adventure or some mystical force. It was about the small acts of kindness, the connections between people, and the way those connections could change everything. The elderly man had spent so long thinking that his life was insignificant, that he had nothing to offer, but in that moment, he understood. His life, his choices, had mattered more than he could have ever known. The world wasn't as dark as he had thought. It wasn't as lonely as he had believed. He had been shown the way, and now, he had to choose whether to walk down it. The elderly man took a deep breath, looking at the little girl and then at the stranger, his heart finally understanding. It wasn't too late. It wasn't too late to change. To finally see. To finally live. And that was the lesson that would change everything for him. The lesson that would make him see life in a new light. It wasn't too late. It was never too late. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The girl stood frozen, the weight of everything that had unfolded crashing down on her. The stranger's words hung in the air, threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm the man who was sent to finish what you started." The elderly man looked older now, as if every year of his hidden past had finally caught up to him. He hadn't wanted the girl to be involved, but there was no denying it now. She had seen too much, and the wheels were already in motion. "What do you mean by that?" the girl demanded, her voice shaking but determined. She wasn't going to back down, not now. She had come this far, and she needed answers, no matter how dangerous they might be. The stranger's eyes softened, just slightly, but there was no warmth behind them. He looked at the elderly man one last time, then turned to the girl. "I'm not here to hurt you. I never was. But the truth, the whole truth, is a dangerous thing to carry. It's why the old man walked away from everything. He thought he could outrun his past, but it's never that simple." The elderly man's face crumpled with regret, and for a moment, he seemed like a shadow of the person he once was. "I tried to forget. I tried to leave it all behind. But the things we did, the choices we made, they don't let go so easily. They come back, always." The girl felt a chill run through her as the stranger's words began to sink in. This wasn't just about one old man's mistakes. This was something much bigger, something that had impacted lives, changed the course of history in ways she couldn't yet understand. For a long moment, no one spoke. The girl stood there, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. She had thought she was helping an old man. But now, she saw it clearly, she had been drawn into a story that spanned decades, filled with secrets, betrayals, and consequences far beyond anything she had ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why now?" The elderly man's eyes met hers. There was a deep sadness in them, but also something else, a kind of acceptance. "Because you're the key. You've always been the key, ever since you helped me that day. You don't realize it, but your action set something in motion, something I couldn't stop." The girl felt her heart race. "What do you mean? What did I do?" The stranger stepped forward, his tone becoming softer, almost respectful. "You gave him something he hadn't had in years. Hope. That's why we came back, both of us. To finish what we started. But now, the question is, do you want to be part of this?" The girl's mind spun. She had no idea what they were talking about, no idea how she had suddenly become so deeply involved in their world of secrets. But one thing was clear, this was her choice now. She had stepped into a world of shadows and lies, but the path ahead was hers to choose. The elderly man stood slowly, his voice hoarse. "I can't undo what I've done. I can't change the past. But you still have time. Time to make your own choices. Time to decide whether to walk away or face what's ahead." For a long time, the girl didn't speak. She felt the weight of the decision bearing down on her, but she also felt something else, a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger, but it was also filled with the possibility of something more. Something that could change everything. For her. For the elderly man. For the world. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But I know one thing. I'm not going to run away from this. I'm not going to ignore it. I want to understand. I want to know the truth." The elderly man nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through his worn expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The stranger, too, seemed to approve, though his face remained unreadable. "Then you'll find your way," the elderly man said quietly. "Just remember, some truths are more dangerous than others. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them." With those final words, the girl made her choice. She didn't know where this journey would lead or what dangers awaited her. But she knew one thing for sure, she had uncovered a story that had been buried for too long, and now, it was hers to tell. As the door closed behind her, the girl stepped into the unknown, knowing that the answers she sought would change everything, not just for the old man, but for herself as well. And with that realization, she understood the most important lesson of all: sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that lead to the greatest discoveries. In seeking the truth, we uncover not just the past, but also our own future.